The year is 1000. Across the fledgling nations of Christian Europe, a nervous energy hangs in the air. For generations, preachers and mystics had spoken of this moment, the turn of the first millennium since the time of Christ. For many, it was not a time for celebration, but for judgment. It was the dawn of a new century, one that many believed would be humanity's last. But the apocalypse did not arrive. The world did not end. Instead, it was reforged. The 100 years that followed, from 1000 to 1100, would prove to be one of the most transformative, violent, and consequential centuries in the history of Christianity. It was a century that would see the faith permanently tear itself in two, and a century that would unleash a holy war that would shape the destiny of continents. The fear of the apocalypse was rooted in a deep sense of instability. The Viking Age, which had terrorized the coasts of Europe for centuries, was only just sputtering to a close. New threats were emerging, with Magyar horsemen raiding from the east and Saracen pirates patrolling the Mediterranean. The old Carolingian order had fractured, leaving a complex web of feudal loyalties where power was personal, held by warriors who swore fealty to a lord in exchange for land. This was a world of castles and knights, of subsistence farming and endemic local warfare. It was a society desperate for order and a sense of divine purpose. To understand this era, we must first see the world as they did. In the West, the successor to Charlemagne's domain, the Holy Roman Empire, vied for supremacy over a patchwork of feudal kingdoms, duchies, and city-states. In the East, the magnificent Byzantine Empire, centered in the glorious city of Constantinople, saw itself as the true inheritor of the Roman legacy, the bastion of Orthodox Christianity. For the common person, life was local, brutal, and short. Their world was the village, their lord, and their church. The church was the unquestioned center of society. It marked the hours of the day, the seasons of the year, and the milestones of life from baptism to burial. Its language, Latin, was the language of God, law, and learning, binding a fragmented continent together. Yet this institution was far from pure. Corruption was rampant. The practice of simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was common, and many priests and bishops lived openly with wives and concubines. But a powerful wave of reform was stirring, originating from the Abbey of Cluny in France. These reformers sought to purify the church, enforce clerical celibacy, and most importantly, free it from the control of secular kings and emperors. This drive for independence would light the fuse for the century's first great explosion. Long before the year 1054, the two great halves of Christianity had been drifting apart. In Rome, they spoke Latin. In Constantinople, Greek. Western priests were celibate. Eastern priests could marry. They even used different bread in the Eucharist. But the deepest rift was theological and political. The West had added a single phrase to the Nicene Creed, stating the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son, the Filioque clause. To the East, this was an unauthorized heretical alteration of a sacred text. Even more divisive was the question of power. The Pope in Rome, citing his succession from the Apostle Peter, claimed ultimate authority over the entire church. The Eastern patriarchs, however, saw him as merely the first among equals in a council of 5 great leaders, a pentarchy governing the faith. They would never submit to the absolute rule of one man. The breaking point came in 1054. A headstrong pope, Leo IX, sent an equally stubborn envoy, Cardinal Humbert, to Constantinople to settle disputes with the fiery patriarch, Michael Cerularius. The negotiations were a disaster of arrogance and misunderstanding. On July 16th, in a moment of shocking drama, Cardinal Humbert marched into the Grand Cathedral of Hagia Sophia and placed a papal bull, a formal decree, on the high altar, excommunicating Patriarch Michael and his followers. These were not just abstract theological debates. They reflected a profound cultural and political divide. The Byzantine East was a centralized, urbanized empire with a legacy of classical learning and sophisticated bureaucracy. Its religious art was rich with symbolism, its liturgy ancient and poetic. The Latin West was more rural, more fragmented, and more militaristic. Its theology was becoming increasingly legalistic, focused on questions of law, sin, and papal jurisdiction. The two halves of the old Roman Empire no longer spoke the same language, literally or metaphorically. In response, the Patriarch convened his own council and promptly excommunicated the papal legates. The Great Schism was complete. While it would take centuries for the full reality of this division to trickle down to the common believer, the formal split between what would become the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches was now a fact. A unified Christendom was no more. As the Church in the East broke away, the papacy in the West was consolidating its power, leading to its next great conflict. This was not a war of theology, but of politics, known as the investiture controversy. The question at its heart was simple but profound. Who had the right to appoint a bishop? Was it the Pope, the spiritual father of the Church, or was it the king or emperor who granted the bishop vast lands and feudal power? In essence, did the Church answer to God or to the state? This struggle found its champions in two titanic figures, Pope Gregory VII, a fierce and uncompromising reformer, and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. Gregory was determined to stamp out lay investiture and assert papal supremacy. In 1075, he issued a decree forbidding any secular ruler from investing a cleric with the symbols of his office. Henry, who relied on loyal bishops to run his empire, openly defied him. Gregory responded with his ultimate weapon, excommunication. He cast the emperor out of the church, declaring him deposed and freeing his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. Suddenly, Henry's nobles were in open revolt. Desperate, Henry had to submit. In the winter of 1077, he journeyed across the Alps to the Pope's castle at Canossa. For 3 days, the most powerful man in Europe stood as a barefoot penitent in the snow, begging for the Pope's forgiveness. When Gregory finally absolved him, it was a stunning demonstration of papal power, a signal that the Church was now a political force capable of humbling empires. Though Henry's humiliation at Canossa was a powerful symbol, it did not end the conflict. The struggle over investiture would continue for decades, a running sore in the relationship between popes and emperors. But the precedent had been set. The papacy had established itself as a sovereign power, a kind of spiritual monarchy that could command the allegiance of Christians across political boundaries. This new, assertive, and international church, forged in the fires of reform and controversy, was now ready to project its power in a dramatic new direction. With its Western house in order, the papacy now turned its gaze outward. A new power had risen in the East. The Seljuk Turks, a nomadic people converted to Islam, they had swept across the Middle East, conquering Baghdad and crushing the Byzantine army at the pivotal Battle of Manzikert in 1071. They seized control of Anatolia, the Byzantine heartland, and captured the holy city of Jerusalem. Christian pilgrims, who had long traveled to the city, now reported harassment and persecution. The new Byzantine emperor Alexios I, facing annihilation, sent a desperate plea to the West. He wrote to Pope Urban II requesting skilled mercenaries to help him reclaim his lost territories from the Turks. The emperor hoped for a few regiments of elite knights. What he would get was a continent on the march, driven by a religious fervor the world had never seen. In November 1095, at the Council of Clermont in France, Pope Urban delivered one of the most influential speeches in history. Speaking to a vast crowd of clergy and nobles, he described the suffering of Eastern Christians and the desecration of the Holy Land. He called upon the knights of Europe to stop fighting each other and turn their swords against a common enemy. He offered them an unprecedented reward, a plenary indulgence. All those who took up the cross and journeyed to liberate Jerusalem would have all their sins forgiven. It was a potent combination of religious duty, feudal ambition, and the promise of salvation. As he finished, a cry rose from the crowd, a chant that would become the motto of the movement, Deus vult, God wills it. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Preachers fanned out across Europe, and tens of thousands, from great lords to common peasants, sewed crosses on their clothes and prepared for war. The First Crusade had begun. After a long and arduous journey marked by incredible hardship and brutal sieges, the main army of crusaders reached the walls of Jerusalem in 1099. On July 15th, they breached the defenses and took the city in a horrific storm of violence and slaughter. But Urban's call was heard not just by the nobility. It electrified the common people, who were whipped into a frenzy by charismatic preachers like Peter the Hermit. Long before the main army of knights was ready, a vast, disorganized, and ill-equipped mob of peasants, artisans, and petty criminals set off for the Holy Land. This so-called People's Crusade was a disaster. Lacking discipline and supplies, they pillaged their way across Europe, massacring Jewish communities in the Rhineland in a horrific prelude to the violence to come. When they finally reached Anatolia, they were swiftly annihilated by the Seljuk Turks. It was a brutal lesson that faith alone could not win a holy war. The official crusade, led by powerful nobles like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Bohemond of Taranto, was a much more formidable force. Yet their journey was no less grueling. They marched thousands of miles through hostile territory, facing starvation, disease, and the constant harassment of Turkish forces. They were a fractious coalition, often divided by personal ambition and rivalry. They won a key victory at Dorylaeum and endured a hellish 7-month siege to capture the city of Antioch. By the time they finally laid eyes on the walls of Jerusalem in the summer of 1099, their numbers had been greatly reduced, but their resolve was hardened by a potent mix of piety and desperation. The 11th century, which began in quiet fear of the world's end, concluded with a cataclysmic act of Christian expansion. It was a century that saw the church fracture into East and West, a wound that has never fully healed. It witnessed the papacy rise to become a dominant, independent power, capable of challenging emperors and commanding armies. Most profoundly, it unleashed the crusading ideal, a new form of holy pilgrimage, warfare that would define the relationship between Christianity and Islam for centuries to come. The world did not end in the year 1000. Instead, a new and far more complex world was born, one forged in the fires of schism, power, and the call to a distant holy war. The capture of Jerusalem did not end the story. It began a new, complex chapter. The victorious Crusaders did not simply return home. They established 4 new states in the conquered lands: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These Crusader states, or Outremer, the land beyond the sea, were feudal European kingdoms transplanted into the heart of the Middle East. They were a Christian military aristocracy ruling over a diverse population of local Christians, Muslims, and Jews. For nearly 200 years, these states would be a focal point of conflict, drawing new waves of crusaders from Europe and provoking a powerful Islamic counterattack, a jihad, to reclaim the Holy Lands. The world of 1100 was left with a new, bitter, and enduring fault line, one whose tremors can still be felt in the political and religious landscape of the modern world.